the Electoral College, how we select a president, how it had to be amended very quickly afterwards because it was so inartfully drafted. We'll talk about what led them to this compromise, one of many that's associated with the writing of the US Constitution, which took place in 1787 as a replacement for the ineffectual Articles of Confederation. And it's one of many compromises, and we'll talk about why they did that. Then I'd like to identify some elections where that is demonstrated, how the Electoral College affected the outcome of certain elections. Then we'll talk about how we feel about this, what's the nature of Electoral College politics and how it's changed over the years. And if you think we should do something about it, we can talk about what we might do. First of all, I would say to you that the Founding Fathers never anticipated a popular vote for president. I hate to disappoint everyone, but the Founding Fathers didn't trust you to vote directly for president. It's an indirect system and they never anticipated the development of political parties, which, as you might expect, affects how the Electoral College works. Let's go through what was in the original US Constitution that created the Electoral College. And if my friends at the library and Historical Society can do this now, we can go to a document that has a little summary of the provisions of the compromise. Well, as I said, it's an indirect vote. It's not a direct vote, and it was never considered. They pretty much dismissed the idea of a popular vote. They left it up to the states to decide how electors would be selected. The first election we had, which was in 1788, that extended into 1789, because in those days, the election, until the mid-1800s, we didn't have one election day. It was done during the fall and into the end of the year, and sometimes, as with the first one, into the following year. In the first election, only 6 states actually had a popular vote to select the electors. The other ones had other systems for selecting the electors. We didn't have a full popular vote until the election of 1824. That means that every state had set up a system whereby they had an election to select electors. And the process of selecting the electors and who was eligible to vote is all left up to the states, and they're all different. As an example, when we passed the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which said you couldn't discriminate on voting rights based on gender, there were already several states that allowed women to vote. So the states set their own standards, their own process, and their own eligibility to vote. Okay, so it's an indirect vote. The number of votes that a state has based on the Constitution is the amount of representatives they have in Congress. So House members and members of the Senate. Every state has 2 senators, and the House membership is based on population. You can see what this does. It gives an advantage, a disproportionate share of the vote to smaller states with less population, which was done on purpose. And we can talk about why they did that. To get elected, a president had to get a majority of the electoral votes of the Electoral College. Their idea was the person with the second highest vote total would become vice president. We will discover when we finish going through this that those constitutional provisions were very inartfully drafted and had to be corrected to an extent with an amendment that happened right after the nearly disastrous election of 1800, which we'll talk about, that ran into this flaw in the way they drafted the constitutional provision. So they meant to have votes be for vice president and president, but they didn't make a distinction. And each elector had 2 votes. And they sort of thought it would be for vice president and president, but they didn't distinguish. So for instance, in the first election, Alexander Hamilton went around telling people, don't vote for John Adams, who was running as vice president with George Washington, who was running as president, because obviously, if everyone used their 2 votes for those 2 people, there'd be a tie, and then it goes into a whole other process of selecting the president. So they recognized almost immediately that it was badly drafted. In the event of a tie, or one candidate doesn't have a majority of the votes, the original constitutional provision was the names of the top 5 candidates. So here's an example. They didn't really anticipate the development of what we have now, 2 main political parties, are sent to the House of Representatives to select the president. Now, they probably decided on the House of Representatives because that was popularly elected. Remember, the original US Senate was appointment by state legislators. It wasn't until Woodrow Wilson's time as president in the 1900s that we had direct election of US senators. And the voting process in the House is kind of interesting. Each House delegation has 1 vote. So for instance, if there was a difference of opinion and they didn't actually come up with one person with the state's votes, the state wouldn't have a vote. And you had to win. The only way you could win is have a majority of those votes. Now, this process has really been only used twice. The election of 1800, which we'll talk about, which was the election of Thomas Jefferson, in the election of 1824. Remember, that's the first election where we actually had a full popular vote for president. And that process elected John Quincy Adams. Now, as I said, they ran into a problem almost immediately because the way this is drafted. So they quickly went through the process of amending the Constitution, which is not such an easy thing to do, but this was amended pretty quickly because people recognized the mistake they made. So we could look at the amendment provisions now, if we can put them up for people to look at. Okay, let's take a look. Hey, interesting. One of the things is the president and vice president can't come from the same state. So ticket splitting as a strategy for winning an election started at the very beginning. And I don't know if anyone remembers this, but in 2000, when George Bush decided, who was the Republican nominee for president, he decided he wanted to have Dick Cheney run his vice presidential candidate. Dick Cheney had to change his official address because he lived in Texas, the same state that George Bush lived in. And he was from Wyoming, so he changed his residence to Wyoming. Then they corrected it so you vote for president and vice president separately. And then they set up the process of how the votes are presented to the federal government. And they set up the process whereby the electoral votes are sent to the president of the Senate, which, as we all know from what we've gone through in recent days, is the vice president. And the votes are counted in the presence of the House and the Senate. That's an issue that had to be clarified after the election of 1876 with federal law, change in federal law, clarifying some of these provisions. And you may recall that during this last Electoral College election, there was a challenge to that process and the role of the vice president that was presented to the Supreme Court, but the court refused to consider it. In those days, when this amendment was passed, the presidential transition, the inauguration took place in March. That's since been changed by amendment to be, as we know, January. Then they set up a provision for if there's not enough votes for vice president, how that's settled, and it goes to the Senate to be settled in that way. So there are still, well, I've already mentioned a couple of things. There are still some issues here that are not quite that clear, even after the original constitutional language and the amendment to the Constitution. We have a very unique system. It obviously is a compromise. So why do you think they did this? Why did they set up this sort of unusual process? There's another country in the world that elects their chief executive this way. Well, we actually know what they were thinking. Thanks to James Madison, who kept minutes of the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia in 1787. And we also have the Federalist Papers, which are not official government documents. I'm sure we remember this from our civics classes. The Federalist Papers were written as a advocacy for approving the Constitution, because once they were done, each state had to approve the Constitution. And by the way, it wasn't a sure thing. There was a lot of opposition, not so much of what was in the Constitution, but what was not in the Constitution. Obviously, Bill of Rights, for instance. And there were two factions that were involved in that debate. So we didn't have approval of the Constitution until there was an agreement that would be immediately Bill of Rights passed with different provisions for essentially individual protections. By the way, by the first presidential vote, which was George Washington and John Adams, two states couldn't vote because they hadn't ratified the Constitution yet. And that was North Carolina and Rhode Island. And by the way, one state, New York, didn't get the votes in on time and their votes weren't counted. So what were they thinking? Well, I don't know about you. It's been a long time since I was in high school, but back at old Wheaton Community High School in Wheaton, Illinois, what they explained to me in my history classes was this was a system developed to protect the rights of smaller states. So they would be protected from too much majority rule. Now, that's the issue in the abstract, but specifically, I would say maybe the elephant in the room was the issue of slavery. They never addressed slavery in the Constitution. Unlike Great Britain, which abolished slavery before this, they essentially would not have had a constitution if they tried to address slavery. There were plenty of people that were against slavery, abolitionists. There were plenty of people who felt it shouldn't spread from where it is. But there are also a number of states where slavery was an important part of their economic system. And they were concerned that the majority might do something to limit their reliance on slavery and the issue of slavery. So although it wasn't discussed much, that was the driving force behind this idea of protecting minority rights through the way we elected a president. The other main factor was, remember I told you they didn't trust us to vote directly. It's they had very big concerns about a future, as they put it, demagogue, that's their language, ascending to the presidency. That if it was open to the public and a direct vote, they might be influenced by a future demagogue. So their thought was, hey, these electors are going to be good, solid people appointed by the states in whatever way they select, and they would protect us against a bad person becoming president. And the issue was their experience with Great Britain in Europe. They looked at the system that went on between monarchs in Europe, and they wanted to stay as far away from that as they could. One example is the big debate about how you elect a president, what you call him, included the president's powers and limits on the powers. And as an example, the impeachment clause in the Constitution came out directly from their fear of a future demagogue, like the way monarchs acted in Europe. And very specifically, James Madison, who made the pitch for this, said he was concerned about a future president cutting a deal with foreign governments to help himself benefit financially or politically. So this fear of a future demagogue affected a lot of what they put into the Constitution. Now, let's, by the way, you get some more information in there about different amendments to the Constitution that affected the way we select presidents, which is not particularly relevant to what we're talking about today, but you know, it's interesting. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk about some elections that were affected by the provisions in the Constitution in this sort of unusual method of selecting a president. I gave you electoral maps, which geeky as I am, I enjoy looking at. We can start looking at them now. The first one is the election of 1800, which, you know, obviously happened pretty quickly. This was when John Adams ran for re-election. He succeeded after George Washington was elected twice and then chose not to run for a third term. At that time, there were no limits on the number of terms. He set a precedent that had lasted until the Constitution was amended in the 1950s. So John Adams ran and won the first time. And this is, he was running for re-election. And he ran against, his main opponent was Thomas Jefferson. And what had happened over time in those early years is there was a distinct split between groups that became what we would call now political parties. The Jefferson people called themselves Democrat Republicans. The George Washington, John Adams people called themselves Federalists. And the big issue was over individual rights and federal power and the power of the presidency. So in this case, Thomas Jefferson running as a Democratic Republican and John Adams was running as a Federalist. They both had vice presidents that ran with them. Adams had Pinckney from South Carolina. Jefferson had Aaron Burr from New York. You can see how the ticket balancing played into play very early in the presidential election game. And this is an interesting election because Alexander Hamilton at the last minute turned on John Adams. Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist and an ally of supposedly Washington and Adams, but he turned against Adams. And in those days, their version of Facebook was pamphlets that were printed and distributed. And he just did a scathing attack on John Adams and his performance in his first term that actually turned the tide a little bit. And you can see that how Jefferson from Virginia won New York largely because of the attacks, the historians say, largely because of the attacks of Alexander Hamilton, but also because he had a New Yorker on his ticket with him, Aaron Burr. But lo and behold, remember I told you that Alexander Hamilton told people, don't vote for John Adams in that first election because otherwise we're going to end up with a tie if you use your two votes. Well, somebody didn't get the memo because the Jefferson people, they used all their two votes to vote for both Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Well, Burr was running to be vice president, not to be president. Well, if it's a tie, remember what I said before, it goes to the House of Representatives. Well, the House of Representatives was mostly Federalist Party people. They didn't have a dog in this hunt. And there was a long delay of voting in the House of Representatives about who was going to become president. And no one was getting a majority. And in the narrative below the maps, I point out that there were, Jefferson was not elected until the 36th ballot, almost running into the inauguration date in March. And how did it happen? It's Alexander Hamilton again. He came back and said to his Federalist buddies, the lesser of two evils is Jefferson. He didn't like either of them. He really didn't like Burr, as we learned later when they had a duel. And so it's because of Alexander Hamilton that Thomas Jefferson was eventually elected by the House of Representatives to be the president in 1800. Now, think about this. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is generally viewed as one of our greatest presidents, but his ascension to the presidency was very precarious. And the way he got elected in 1800 was, strange. Now, it was right after this that we had that 12th Amendment that we looked through the provisions of. It was, I think, ratified in as early as 1803. So very quickly, some of the flaws in the constitutional language were corrected. And I gave a book citation on that. It's a great book, The Tumultuous Election of 1800. I think it's a terrific book that describes this in detail. It's a fascinating story of people that are interested in American history. Hey, let's go to the next election that I picked out, which is the election of 1824. It's the first time that all the states selected the popular vote vehicle for naming their electors. So candidates had slates of electors that represented them in those different states. And the vote, again, is indirect. But all the states at that time had a popular vote for the electors. Again, remember, this is not something that was anticipated by the founding fathers. So, irony of ironies, in the first election that had a popular vote for president, the candidate that had the most popular votes and the most electoral votes didn't become president. And that's Andrew Jackson. He was a senator from Tennessee. He had four basic opponents. Jackson got something like 41% of the popular vote. He got most of the Electoral College votes, but not a majority. And the second, in terms of popular vote, was actually Crawford, who was a Treasury Secretary, but he was a man who was very ill at the time, and I don't really think he was a viable candidate by the time they actually, this was thrown to the House and they had the vote. And John Quincy Adams, who was the existing Secretary of State. They were all of the same party, which was called Democratic Republicans again. The Federalist Party had virtually disappeared at that point. One of the flaws that's possible in the Electoral College process is kind of obvious here, is that it's possible to manipulate the Electoral College vote in a way that you wouldn't have with a popular vote. And that's what happened in this 1824 election. Clay Henry Clay finished fourth, so his name was not submitted to the House. And he ended up cutting a deal. Now, there's some historical dispute about this, but I think it's pretty obvious what happened. John Quincy Adams offered Clay the ability to be Secretary of State, which he wanted, and he threw his support to John Quincy Adams. So then John Quincy Adams was elected by the House of Representatives to be president. It was called by Andrew Jackson the corrupt bargain. And he was so upset, Andrew Jackson, that he resigned from the Senate. Remember, he was appointed from Tennessee, and spent 4 years trying to undermine John Quincy Adams. He then trounced Adams when Adams won for re-election and became president in 1828. This is the beginning of the tremendous influence that Andrew Jackson had on our political history. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote the book about the age of Jackson. Probably a lot of us read that when we were going to school. A little bit of a myth, if you ask me, created by this historian about it. But so when he ran in 1828, that was the end of this name of the party as Democrat Republican, and it became the Democratic Party. Jackson also was a big mover behind having an actual convention where the party nominated a presidential candidate, which happened when he ran for re-election in 1832. And he also was a big advocate for a primary system before the convention, where people had a chance to actually vote on who their state was going to support to be president. And he was very influential, so influential that he was the rationale for creating another party. The Whig Party, which we may remember from our history books, was formed in the 1830s primarily as an anti-Andrew Jackson party, also anti-slavery. And they had the misfortune of the first two times that they elected presidents, the presidents died in office. I don't know why I'm laughing about that. It's not funny, but that was the precursor to the eventual Republican Party, which also was very much a part of the anti-slavery movement. So let's move forward to an infamous election, greatly affected by the Electoral College process, the election of 1876. I was shocked that in the debate, I don't know how many people watched the debate of the Electoral College certification, but one of the senators brought up this election as justification for having a commission to decide how to investigate the elections in the different places and settle the Electoral College dispute. The senator needs to open up a history book. That's not a good justification for anything. This is a case of an election where the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, Samuel Tilden, won the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. His opponent was Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican. There ended up being dispute about the votes, the popular vote and the Electoral College vote in 3 states. And interesting enough, if you watch those debates about the certification process, Lindsey Graham brought it up because South Carolina was one of the states. I thought it was interesting. I was kind of impressed that he was familiar with the issue. But South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana's votes were disputed for different reasons. Louisiana was about the form of the ballot. Florida was about voter intimidation. But and there was one vote in Oregon that was called open to question because it turned out they split their electoral vote, which was contrary to state law, but it turned out that the one elector who voted for Tilden was not eligible to be an elector because he was a government official. So 20 votes are in dispute. Now, the only way Rutherford Hayes could have got elected president an electoral college system is if he got all of those disputed votes. You have to win them all. And then he'd win by one vote. So that process of sending the electoral college votes to the president of the Senate took place, but they had competing slates of electors. You remember the South then was under military control, and they had actually alternative governments in some of those states. So there was a long debate, and one of the issues we heard again with this election, if you remember that a congressman from Texas who filed suit about over the issue of the discretion of the vice president in counting the electoral votes. There was an issue about whether it's the House and the Senate have to agree, or if it's the vice president has the discretion to do the votes. And it was in a deadlock. And former President Ulysses Grant suggested a commission. The commission was set up. Long story short, again, a deal was cut. Just like the 1824 election. That's a possibility with the Electoral College process. So I'm being a little glib about it, but essentially the Southern Democrats cut a deal with the Northern Republicans and agreed to not contest the Electoral College votes for Rutherford B. Hayes. So he was going to get all 20 of those votes if he would agree to remove the federal troops from the South. So remove military control. The troops were there to enforce the changes in the Constitution that gave rights to freed slaves. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that led to almost a century of civil rights violations, because when it was left up to the states, they instituted a lot of segregation laws, issues about schools and public accommodations. It wasn't corrected until the 1960s when we had our civil rights legislation. So there's an example of a very negative effect caused by the Electoral College in that election of 1876. Again, why was Senator Cruz quoting that election? I do not know. I'd love to hear his explanation. Now, after this was over, they passed a law. The federal government passed a law. It was called the Electoral College Act of 1887, pretty soon after the election, right? And it was meant to clarify the confusion that took place in the 1876 election. Their objectives were to, one, remove as much as they could any discretion on the part of the vice president in terms of counting the electoral votes, and to create a more clear process of certifying the Electoral College results. That's what you heard about, the idea of the governor or secretary of state certifying the results of the election. Then the Electoral College folks meet at a location. There's a safe harbor created by the date by which the governor or secretary of state has to certify things. Then those are sent to not just the vice president, president of the Senate, but also to the National Archives, the federal district judge in that district, which is usually the state capital. It was meant to clarify it. And originally, when that Texas congressman, if everyone remembers this, he filed suit and he was arguing that the vice president should have discretion in terms of accepting or not accepting electoral votes. And I thought, when I was following it, that they were challenging that Electoral College Act of 1877, because the issue would be, obviously, I guess, is that the right way to change the process? Because it's in the Constitution. Shouldn't it be a constitutional amendment? Or is it just clarifying what's already in the Constitution? But it's never been challenged, and it's always been followed. But he didn't present it that way. For the life of me, I don't know why, because that would have been a legal challenge of that law going back to 1876 1977, which, actually is an issue, I think. I don't know how the court would rule. The Supreme Court and other courts are very reluctant to interfere with local elections anyway, because as we know from the Constitution, these are state elections, they're not federal elections. That would be a question maybe a little bit when we get to the election of 2000, if you remember that one. So now, moving ahead, let's look at a couple of more recent elections. And one is the election of 2000. I lost my maps here on my screen. I don't know if everyone else can see it or not, but we have, okay, we have to go to the next map. Yeah, here we go. Election of 2000. We probably all remember this. We had Vice President Al Gore was running. It's wrong in my narrative. I put Al Gore as U.S. Senator from Tennessee, which he was at one point, but he was Vice President. It illustrates something, by the way, that it's very difficult for anybody representing the incumbent administration to run when they're not the incumbent. As a matter of fact, when George Bush Sr. was elected, it was the first sitting vice president to get elected since Martin Van Buren in 1836, succeeding Andrew Jackson. It's a tough road to hoe because you don't really get credit for what was done before you, but you get all the blame. It's a tough thing to do. Now, very close election. George Bush was governor of Texas, well prepared to be a chief executive. I think probably being governor is better preparation than being a senator or a representative, my opinion. Very close election. And if you all remember, it came down to the state of Florida. And I don't know if I need to go through all the elements of the election disputes in Florida, but there was issues about the design of ballots in certain places. There were different machine and other recounts done. George Bush in any count that went on over time, he had a slight lead. There was never a time when Al Gore was shown to be leading, but the margin was very low. I have down there 537 votes. I think that was the final differential. So you had the George Bush contingent arguing, stop counting the votes, it's over, George Bush won Florida. And you had Al Gore's people saying, hey, let's recount those counties where there was problems with the ballot, like Palm Beach County. Remember that? The hanging chads and all that. So Gore's strategy was, let's recount the places where I ran stronger to see if I don't gain enough votes. And the George Bush people their position was, don't count the votes. Kind of a tough position to take, I think. But so it ended up, as you might expect, in the Florida Supreme Court, where it's an appropriate venue. It's a state election, remember? Well, the state of Florida Supreme Court decided that there should be a manual recount of the entire state. Pretty logical. I'm not a lawyer, but a pretty logical position to take. Meanwhile, you remember that Electoral College Act back in 1877? The Florida government used that to certify the election of George Bush. So you had a Secretary of State and a governor were both Republicans. Well, the governor was the brother of the presidential candidate. So they certified. They did everything supposed to do to certify the election based on the results, irrespective of what the Supreme Court said. The Bush people went directly to when the Supreme Court gave that decision in Florida, the Bush people went to the federal court in Atlanta, dismissed quickly, as you might expect. It's a state election and the Supreme Court has called for a recount. What could be more logical than recounting the votes? But then they appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did something that was pretty unusual. They stopped the recount. This is the Supreme Court of the state of Florida where it's a Florida election. It's not a federal election. They stopped the recount to consider the arguments. Then when they reached the conclusion to basically make George Bush president because validating the certifications that had come in from the governor and the secretary of state, they said, hey, there isn't time enough to complete the recount. So, but they created the delay by stopping the recount. It's actually, and most historians call this one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. I've done a course on the Supreme Court and the history of how it was created. The judiciary was created in the Constitution, and then the various decisions they made, bad and good. And that's usually one of the worst ones. And, you know, as a corollary to that, the court actually said it can't be used as a precedent, even though Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh cited it in one of the Supreme Court decisions that were made in the Pennsylvania vote, which escaped me as the relevance of that because the decision said it had no precedent-setting value. So there's an example. Now, left unsaid here is that actually Al Gore won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes. So again, here's a case where the issue was over the Electoral College vote, and it actually got to the Supreme Court and led to, I'm not taking sides about the, you know, who was the best candidate for president. I'm just saying that, hey, there should have been a recount because that's what the Supreme Court of Florida said. So that's an interesting story, I think. And now we have another recent one in which in 2016, let's look at that map. Now that was unusual. In 2016, the first woman running for a major party presidential candidate, again, she had the same problem that Al Gore had. She was representing the incumbent party, but she wasn't an incumbent. And running against a businessman with really no experience in government. The closest I could come to with a major party candidate with that kind of situation was Wendell Willkie when he ran against FDR. When FDR ran for a third term, Wendell Willkie was a private businessman from Indiana. But he did have a lot of international experience, but he had no government experience. The election, again, you had the popular vote won by the Democratic candidate Clinton by about 3 million votes. And the Electoral College won by the Republican candidate. And then there was the issue of interference by a foreign government. And it's pretty much been confirmed that there was interference by Russian hackers. No sense in going through all that now, but I think people are sort of familiar with it. It's pretty much been confirmed that there was this interference. Then the issue was there collusion with the Republican Party and President Trump's people in the election? And there's a lot of suspicious circumstantial evidence about that. You know, the campaign manager briefing Russian operatives on polling data, the Roger Stone connection to WikiLeaks, the timing and sophistication of the Russian interference on social media. It would be a tough legal case to make, but it was a subject of an investigation that the decision was made by the House of Representatives not to proceed with impeachment, even though a lot of impeachable acts were identified. So, and that does happen. I mean, someone can be guilty of impeachable acts, but the decision might be to not remove them for office, whatever the reason is. So the closest thing I can remember to that was the Reagan-Iran-Contra matter, in which Tip O'Neill argued against, in his party, impeaching Reagan. We didn't know what the reasons were at the time. We know now because his papers have been, he's long gone and his papers have been published, but he was Reagan was well into his second term. It was well known that he was suffering in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and he didn't think it would be a good idea so soon after Watergate for the country to go through that. Now, well, at some point we'll find out why Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership decided not to proceed with impeachment on the Mueller report. But of course, the president was later impeached in connection with his famous perfect phone call with the government of Ukraine. We've already talked about that in terms of impeachment. That sort of behavior is why we have an impeachment clause. But again, the decision still can be made not to remove him from office, even if he's committed impeachable acts. Now, how do you feel about this method of electing a president? And how has it affected our elections? Well, it's something that's happening, which I would say relates to the sophistication we developed in running for office. It's become much more sophisticated than it used to be, and sometimes it takes a more importance than the issue of specific issues that are debated. And an example would be in the Electoral College system, since it's most states except for 2, it's winner take all. If you are, let's say you're a Republican, you're pretty much sure you're not going to win New York. You're pretty sure you're not going to win California. So you end up campaigning, Democrat and Republican, in a small number of states that are competitive instead of over the whole country. Now, the problem with that is electoral college politics. I'm trying to think of a good example. I'll tell you an example. When the governor of Florida started blaming people from New York for the spread of the coronavirus in Florida, he got support from the president. They're both Republicans. There was no price to pay for putting that on New York because Trump knew he wasn't going to win New York. Now, it's not different for a Democrat and Republican, but it's just a recent example of what I'm talking about. So that's how the elections are being affected. And I've taught this, I've lectured on this a few times, and there's a number of people that take a position on the Electoral College that they appreciate the protections involved in it. And usually people say stuff like, I mean, the most common thing people say is, I don't want California. It's always California. I don't want California deciding the election. Well, the problem with that is once you've subjected yourself to Electoral College politics, it makes sure that there's not a competitive election in those other states. Now, for instance, there's a lot of votes in California. And even if you're a Republican and you know you're going to lose a state, if your votes count, you would campaign there because there's a lot of votes and you could do better and affect the overall vote count. But it wouldn't be, theoretically, it wouldn't be as lopsided. I mean, that's an issue that can be debated. Now, I've described the process. It's kind of unusual. It's been manipulated and it has created problems. But do we think it should change? And if we think that, how do we do it? You know, the process of amending the Constitution, which would be the most logical way to do it, is it's not so easy. The Founding Fathers, there's no question about it. It's in all the minutes and it's in the Federalist Papers. They left a lot of room for interpretation of what they put in the Constitution. That's why when some people talk about there being originalists on the Supreme Court, is ridiculous, because that was not what the Founding Fathers felt. They felt it should leave room for interpretation. And, you know, there's some issues like the Supreme Court that there's very little information about it in the Constitution. They left it open to Congress. And in addition, they set up an amendment process. So you can go back and amend the Constitution to fix things. Well, it's not so easy. there's two methods. One is if two-thirds of the House and the Senate in the same term approve an amendment to the Constitution, it then goes to the states, and then you need 3/4 of the states to approve it before it is an official amendment to the Constitution. Some of those amendments have a time frame for it, like 7 years or something. Some don't. And there's still amendments to the Constitution that are still sitting out there that haven't been approved by enough states, like the Equal Rights Amendment, the Balanced Budget Amendment. Those are two. They're still sitting there. Others had, the time has expired. But you know, that, I don't think that would ever happen because there are too many states that have an advantage with the electoral college system. If you're Vermont or New Hampshire, why would you agree to that? Because you have a disproportionate influence in the election than you would have otherwise. There's a movement afoot to have states agree, I think they call it the compact of the states, that they would, in a state, they would allocate their electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote of the nation. And that way you'd get around a constitutional amendment. Now, there's like, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 states that have signed on to this. I'm not sure that would withstand a legal challenge from within their state. If you're in Wyoming and you're a voter in Wyoming and your state voted for one candidate, but the national popular vote was someone else and your state decided to give their electoral votes to not the person that won the state, I think you might have a case under the Constitution of Equal Protection with the Supreme Court. I'm not a lawyer, so I give legal opinions all the time, but I'm not a lawyer. So that'd be a tough road to take also. Another possibility would be, there are two states that don't, part of the problem is the winner take all aspects of it. So you won Florida by 537 votes, you get all their electoral college votes. Nebraska and Maine have proportional voting of the electors. So Maine in the early 70s set up a system where, for instance, they now have 4 electoral votes. There's 1 vote that goes to the winner of the at-large vote, and there are 3 that are given by congressional district, whoever won the congressional district. Nebraska, which changed it more recently in 1992, has 5 votes, and they have 2 at large and 1 for each of their congressional districts. That is a possibility, but you'd have to go state by state. You might think back to the 19th Amendment and how it happened. The suffragette movement, when post-Civil War, when the movements were afoot to amend the Constitution to give rights to freed slaves, and we're talking obviously mostly African Americans, Frederick Douglass, the leader of that effort, decided to disassociate himself from the women's rights movement. And they were not included, they could have been, in those amendments to protect their voting rights. And they got sort of irrationally the cold shoulder from various federal government officials for an amendment to the Constitution. So they actually rolled up their sleeves and went state by state. And by the time the amendment was ratified in 1920, there were a number of states that allowed women to vote, but that was the hard work they did going state by state. It's possible that people could come up with a solution, if you think it should change, a solution to that part of the Electoral College by going state by state and getting changes, and maybe proportional voting is one way to address that. Well, I've certainly enjoyed this. So we talked about what's in the Constitution. We talked about the changes in the law. We talked about the fact that it's still a little bit murky about some of these issues about the Electoral College system that really haven't been corrected yet. We talked about how it affected different elections. And we've survived. There have been very few times when the Electoral College vote hasn't gone along with the popular vote. A few times. It happened with Grover Cleveland in the 1800s. It happened with Al Gore in 2000. It happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016. But most of the time, the popular vote and the Electoral College vote are the same. Now, I'm done talking. There might be some questions, or maybe someone wants to make a statement, because a lot of what I've said are my opinions. My opinions aren't worth any more than yours. So whatever process the library and the Historical Society want to use here, I'm being happy to hear and respond to questions.